Here we go. So first of all, thank you guys so much for coming. As Annalise mentioned, my name is Maheen, and I'm a staff attorney at an organization here, actually just about 10 minutes from here, called Rights for Girls. We are a human rights organization focused on combating gender-based violence against vulnerable young women and girls here in the United States. So a lot of times when you think about human rights, you think about sort of global things or in international context. And what the mission of our organization is to bring a human rights lens to issues impacting vulnerable girls and female identifying youth here in the United States. So issues that you might think of as civil rights issues, we actually take on as both civil rights and human rights issues. And we do that work through a range of advocacy strategies, including campaigning. We do a lot of federal policy. We work very closely with the Campaign for Youth Justice, with a lot of the organizations, actually all of the organizations in here, on the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act advocacy. So a lot of the girl-specific language that's in this most recent version of the bill, which we can talk about in a little bit, is language that we have been advocating for a long time. So I was very excited to be asked to be here, one, because I was a policy fellow when I was in college at the Campaign for Youth Justice in the first class of fellows, and the first project that I worked on was actually a report that the Campaign for Youth Justice eventually put out on trying youth as adults, but I was looking specifically at youth in DC because we know that because DC doesn't have a state prison, right, and because they closed down Lorton, youth that are tried as adults in DC and youth on Native American reservations are generally typically sent farther away, right? So that was sort of my first exposure. I also got to work with a lot of youth and community-led groups in DC around advocacy here in the district, and that was very important for me because, as you'll see, a lot of the work that we do, all of the work that we do actually, is directly informed either by service providers who are working with girls day in and day out, my own experience as a service provider working with girls day in and day out, and survivors of sexual violence and survivors of the system. That is very intentional. That's the way that we choose to do our advocacy, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. But I was also really excited to be here because the fact that this is the first institute and you chose to focus on girls indicates a big shift. When I was in your position, there was really no conversation about girls in the juvenile justice system. There was consistently this idea that they're a smaller percentage of the population, which they are, right? And that if we're going to focus on systemic reform, we need to focus on reform that's really focused on the majority of people that are impacted, right? And there was nothing known specifically about the challenges of girls. In DC at that time, because I also ran a tutoring program at a youth detention facility out here, which used to be called Oak Hill Youth Center and has now been renamed New Beginnings. At that time, they had a girls unit. They closed it down because the district really had stopped arresting and charging girls. But over the last 10 years, we have seen a dramatic shift around the country. More and more girls coming into the system. And so really what today's talk is about is why have we seen such a dramatic increase in girls coming into the juvenile justice system? What's going on? Are their behaviors changing or are our responses changing? So when we first talk about girls, we have to step back, and this is going to be a little interactive, but I want you guys to tell me a little bit about sort of like when we talk about justice-involved girls, if you're thinking, imagine a girl who's coming into a juvenile facility. Can anybody kind of speculate about some of the things that she may be carrying, whether emotionally, physically, mentally, when she enters that facility? What might have happened to her that week? Any ideas? Go ahead.
There's a very high chance that she's experiencing chronic absenteeism from school, other like school and educational based like push-out issues. Okay, so you mentioned two things. Chronic absenteeism is called what in the juvenile justice delinquency context? Truancy, right? So truancy is actually it's one of the primary charges that brings girls into the system. So truancy is because if you're a child, you're legally required to be in school. So if you don't show up to school, you can be detained or referred to a juvenile court. And also, separately, your parents can actually be charged for you being truant in some contexts because that's considered a form of child abuse or neglect to not be ensuring that your child is in school. So truancy is one, and then you also mentioned push-out, right? What's push-out? Oh, so it's the function by which girls girls experience like the criminal justice system in schools, so things like school, what are they called, school resource officers, or like other people or being referred or suspended or expelled because of like small non-punishable by law offenses.
Right. So who's heard of the school to prison pipeline? Right? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I said who's heard of the school to prison pipeline?
Yeah.
Right? And so the school to prison pipeline is this term that really originated from CDF actually, back in even as early as the 70s, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, that really articulated how how certain policies are put in place to push particular kids, usually kids of color or marginalized kids, out of school and into the criminal justice system. Recently, there is an incredible author and advocate, her name is Dr. Monique Morris, who has coined a term push-out. And she coined the term push-out because even in the school to prison context, when you talked about girls, people kept saying, well, it's not happening to girls. And then we got all these numbers that said, well, African American girls are 5 and 6 times more likely to be referred to court from school than their white peers, right? So we know that it's happening to girls, particularly girls of color, right? But it wasn't looking the same, right? So when I would talk about school to prison pipeline impacting girls, even school to prison advocates would tell me, well, you know, the girl isn't being referred to court from a particular incident that's happening at school. The trajectory looks a little different. So what push out really describes is what are the pathways that push girls out of school and into the juvenile justice system. So you mentioned truancy. Why are girls not showing up to school? What's going on in their lives? Abuse.
Sexual, physical, psychological abuse.
Right, so maybe they're experiencing forms of abuse either at school or in the home that they're not equipped to cope with, and that the school or the people in her life are not identifying. Oftentimes, girls are experiencing sexual abuse and harassment at school, and when they respond, they're often disciplined because they don't respond in the ways that we might want them to respond. Maybe they'll be hostile, maybe they'll act out, maybe they'll fight, maybe they'll act in hypersexual ways because they've been conditioned to act that way because of the years and years of abuse that they've experienced. So we've talked about abuse, we've talked about truancy. What else? Think about justice-involved youth generally. When they come into our system, is it because everything is fine in their lives and their neighborhoods?
Are there a lot of crossover youth from the child welfare system?
That's a huge one, right? So there are a lot of youth that are already experiencing instability, neglect, emotional trauma from being removed from their homes. They're involved in the foster care system, right? And girls are disproportionately impacted by what she called crossover, which is a term really described to describe the crossing over of youth between delinquency and dependency systems either way, but more typically it's that a youth will be crossed over from the dependency system to the delinquency system. So, and that is especially common for girls, particularly girls of color. A lot of that has to do, again, with the way that they're being responded to when they experience abuse. So in some states, you can be what's called dual jacketed. So you can have a case in the child welfare system at the same time that you have a case in the delinquency system. They're all part of the family court, but some states allow you to have active cases in both, right? Other states do not. So for example, I was a service provider in California. California has a statute that says they're all part of the same court, right? But if the child welfare system petitions that this child would be better served in the delinquency system, or that child picks up a charge, that child can be crossed over. And it's really at the discretion of a judge. So say I'm in the child welfare system, I keep running away. Technically, that's an arrest for which I can be, that's an offense for which I can be arrested, right? I keep running away, I keep running away. Social worker's like, you know what? We can't appropriately serve this girl. We can't keep her safe. She keeps running away. I'm going to petition that she be transitioned to the delinquency system, right? And so that's how crossover often occurs, particularly in states that don't have dual status. The other thing that our girls are in this juvenile system are living with, there's a lot of different factors, right? Generally speaking, and I'm pretty confident in saying this, there is overwhelming sexism. Regardless of what community you live in, if you are in this country, there is pervasive sexism that runs through our society, our community, our media, in our homes, in our schools, right? So girls are experiencing and carrying all of that, right? But when we're talking about girls who fall at the intersections of multiple identities and systems of oppression, we're talking about sexism, we're talking about racism, we're talking about resistance to accepting gender nonconforming and LGBTQ youth. We're talking about girls who are experiencing a lot of institutional violence on top of a lot of interpersonal violence that they may be experiencing at home, in their communities. They're often witnessing a lot of violence in their communities, right? And we haven't really done a great job of setting up how to identify what's going on in their lives and how to appropriately respond to them. The other thing about girls that's different, and I will say, and I said this at the beginning, when we talk about girls, we're talking about gender nonconforming girls, we're talking about female identifying youth. So that includes trans girls when we talk about girls. There's different types of violence that you experience when you are a gender minority and or from a gender that has not typically been dominant, right? So not male, right? So there are forms of gendered violence that you experience. The type of violence that you experience is often sexual. It's often by someone that knows you. It's more likely to be by someone that knows you, that you have a close relationship with. And when we're talking about sexual violence particularly, we don't have a language around that, right? So there isn't really a space to talk about it. There isn't room that we're given. We don't necessarily know how to ask those questions, and we don't know how to give our girls the language to be able to disclose when they're experiencing that type of violence. So I say all that to say that our girls are carrying a lot. They're carrying a lot when they come into or in contact with our law enforcement, with our schools, with our systems, right? So in terms of what the most common offenses are, we mentioned truancy. Who can guess what the other common offenses are that bring girls into the system?
Prostitution.
Prostitution. Prostitution charges. So it's truancy, prostitution, and there's one more, which I mentioned.
Running away.
Running away, right? Running away, prostitution, truancy are the primary offenses for which girls come into the system. Are any of those offenses violent offenses? No, right? So when people ask, well, you know, why are girls coming in? And someone responds, well, girls are becoming more violent. That's not what our statistics show us, actually. Girls still account for only about 10% of children charged with violent crimes, right? So we're talking about children who are actually being victimized and then are being met with a delinquency response more often than not. So what we know, as I mentioned, is that the share of girls over the last 10 or even 20 years is rising at astronomical rates. So it's about 40 to 45% at every point of contact. More girls are being referred to the courts. More girls are getting detained when they come into court. More girls are getting placed on probation after they're adjudicated. What's adjudicated? What does it mean to be adjudicated? Go ahead.
The juvenile justice equivalent of like a conviction.
Right. So let's step back for a second because I know this is a